Hello and welcome to Inclusion Dialogue, a podcast where we discuss everything related to inclusive education and diversity in the classroom. My name is Joanne Banks and I'm a lecturer in Trinity College Dublin in the School of Education. This podcast consists of interviews between me and leading academics from all over the world where we discuss how we define inclusive and special education. We look at the difference between theory and practice and what inclusion looks like on the ground in our schools. I began this project for my students, and it was to allow them to hear the views of researchers that I was getting them to read in the form of journal articles and research reports. I've been pretty overwhelmed by the response though, and I think as the podcast has grown, it will be of a much broader appeal to other academics, to policymakers, to educators and practitioners, to parents, but also to students themselves. My guest this week is Dr Heidrun Demo, Associate Professor for Inclusive Education and Director of the Competence Centre for School Inclusion at the Free University of Bolzano in Italy. In this interview, we talk about inclusive systems of education, and Heidrun talks us through the historical factors that shaped the Italian education system, which operates a full inclusion model where all children are educated together. Okay, so thank you, Heidrun. I really appreciate you meeting with me, and I really am thankful that you've agreed to participate in our podcast series, Inclusion Dialogue. So it's lovely to meet you, and it's lovely to gain an insight into the Italian context, and I think our listeners will really, really appreciate that. Do you mind if I start our discussion this morning, maybe asking you how you ended up working in the field of inclusive education?
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you for the invitation, for being here. And my past my career started as a primary school teacher. I worked as a so-called support teacher. That is a teacher that in Italian schools is given to classes that are attended also by students with disabilities. And so you are always a co-teacher, so the second teacher staying in the class. And I think this experience was very important for the way I think about inclusive education also nowadays in research. I remember, or I have one memory that really is an aspect that I think has formed me as a person and then as a researcher. I remember I was teaching in a fourth grade, so with children around 9-10 years. And we had one child with Down syndrome in our class. And as I arrived, there was a new teacher that year. I had the feeling I was in a very good situation where this child was part of the group and socialization was working in a way I found almost perfect. He was having good contacts also in informal moments. And yeah, I was amazed. Then we had a meeting with the professionals from the health system. This is something in Italy you have once a year. Teachers meet professionals from the health system together also with families. And there we were struck by what the psychologist said. He told us that this child, looking at the tests he did not show any kind of cognitive progress from the last one he was tested. And so we started to think about what was working or maybe not working in our class. And what we saw is that in a way we had very much moments in which the child could really get in good relationships with the peers. But we also had many moments where the child was doing things in a way that was similar to what the peers were doing, but that were not significant for him. I, for example, remember him doing small circles on sheets of papers. The others were writing, and this was very significant for their learning process, but doing these circles wasn't significant for that child. And so we decided we had to change something, and we started doing just a separate sheet for him with something else. And he started to cry every time we did it because he wanted to do the same. And so I think having this experience, understanding that this was not working in this way, led us as a team. I had really fantastic colleagues that year to develop something very different. That was trying to create a class where doing different things became normality, and where this child had the opportunity to do something that was significant to him, but not feeling to be the only one doing something different. And so we could move forward. And I think this is actually something I've experienced in practice, but I'm trying to do in research also now. Yeah.
That's a really interesting story, and what a lovely example of just how, nobody likes to be made feel different amongst their peers, and he let you know that, really. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I suppose what you ended up doing was a version of universal design for learning, I guess, where you gave more choice to all the students rather than just him, right?
Yeah, we didn't know about the name of what we were doing, but I think it was the direction we had taken.
Yes. And how important do you think in that? I'm gathering quite a lot. Was the kind of sense that there was a team working on this? You don't sound like you were a teacher working in isolation.
Yeah, this is fundamental, because I think me as a support teacher, I could not change just looking at what I was doing, the whole reality of what we plan for the class. It needs to be a team doing it. Otherwise, I could go on changing the sheets we prepare for the child with Down syndrome, but that's not enough. So we had to change the whole context, and for that the team is extremely necessary.
Heidrun, from an Irish perspective, Italy is one of those countries that's always presented as having reached the inclusive destination, if you like. So there's a couple of countries maybe in Europe and Canada and things like that where you would kind of look to as having an inclusive system. So I'm really just interested in maybe if you could give us an overview of the context behind that and why you think Italy, well, first of all, do you agree that it has an inclusive system? But maybe you could give us an overview of the kind of history and the legacy behind, the inclusive system that you have.
Yeah. Well, I agree that Italy has, I would say, an inclusion-oriented system, in the sense that what we are doing or what is happening here, it's almost 40 years we are doing it, so it's really a long history. It's to grant the presence of all children in the school for all. So in terms of presence, yes, Italy is certainly an inclusive system. In terms of the quality of what is happening in the learning and socialization processes for all children and students, well, like all countries, we certainly have some steps we have to move forward. But for the structural conditions, I think Italy has made this choice. It was in the 70s, and it was together with a very important movement that was the institutionalization. You maybe know the name of Basaglia. He was a
psychiatrist.
And he wanted to open up all the institutions where we had people with mental disabilities or disease, and to send them back to their homes, to society, and then obviously to have a support at their homes, but to bring them back to society. And while this process was going on, some parents started to do to organize movements that tried to bring also children with disability in the school for all. So it came all together in a time where this idea of everybody being part of the society just was so important, also from a political point of view. So I think it was also politically another time. What happened then is that we speak of a time of wild integration. So it was a time where many teachers were very much committed with the value of inclusion, but nobody really knew how to deal with it. So there was a very welcoming atmosphere. But then in practice, there were lots of challenges that needed to be faced day per day, and many solutions were invented. And I think it was a time of great creativity led by this strong commitment, strong values, and these brought to some results that, for example, if you look at data that analyze our teachers' attitudes towards inclusion, it's amazing how positive they are. And I think this is because the process started in a time where so many teachers were really convinced about it, and now this is just part of our school system. So you would never have a teacher thinking that she or he is not able to work with a child with a disability. This is just part of what happens to you in your school career. So it's taken for granted.
So that's really fascinating that the teachers today still hold that really positive attitude towards inclusion. But what I'd like to know a little bit more about is why there was such little resistance at the time. Was there really strong political leadership, or was that psychiatrist that you mentioned, was he kind of a really familiar figure for people in order to accept his views?
No, I don't think it was a top-down process related to some very influential political persons. It was more coming from these 1968 movements we had in Italy, and that, the convincement in these values of equality, of all being part of a society, of participation, and this led to this movement of deinstitutionalization that has consequences also for school. And is brought to the idea that all children, it started with younger children, should be part of our classes. And so parents started to organize movements in this direction, but also teachers were very much convinced about this idea.
And you mentioned there a couple of moments ago about the initial barriers, and I think you described it as wild integration, which is a good term to describe it. So the teething problems or the initial challenges that were faced, do you have understanding of that perhaps?
Yeah, it's interesting because some of the challenges are still challenges we are facing now, and I think what this initial phase shows is that if there is a commitment with the values, then you can also find strategies, and it's not just about having technical and strategies, but it's about having a strong will to find ways. And yes, some of the crucial aspects were really related to the way we wanted to reorganize teaching and learning within classrooms. For example, in that year's a very important movement for Italian schools was a movement of cooperation inspired by Freinet, and they developed different methods inspired by Freiné's didactic. For example, using a lot of moments in the circle where children learn to listen to each other, and teachers learn to listen to the children, so that there is a better understanding of the needs and interests of everybody, but also situations that look like laboratories, so that you have classes where you're doing different things at the same moment, and so you can find a way for everybody to be occupied, but in a meaningful way. So I think a lot was about trying to find ways, structure to change our teaching so that everybody can find a place in there.
And can I ask you then, because I presume you're talking then about changes to initial teacher education at that time had to come up to speed with the new, I suppose, profile of the classrooms with this new integration that was happening. Were there any other changes around, say, perhaps funding structures or things like that had to adapt to this new circumstance?
Not really, because Italy, and this is another big difference in relation to other countries, didn't have a very much developed system of special schools or special classes. So yes, we had some special schools, but we had some special classes, but they were already part of our mainstream schools. So they were already in the responsibility and funded by the Ministry of Education in general terms. So it wasn't easy. It wasn't difficult to just close them down. And for what special school concerns, we have to say that in Italy they were never really closed down, the few that we had. It was just regulated in a way that children could go to mainstream schools, and then this happened. So we didn't really have to change. There was, and there still is, a bit of funding of public funding for some very few special schools, but yes, as it wasn't that much developed, structural changes weren't really needed. It was more a cultural change.
And so is the funding structure for schools, you get your main education budget and everything comes out of that, even if it is additional supports for students with, say, disabilities?
No, things changed then, because after the wild integration, there was the feeling, and it was also something that came very much from parents, that students with disabilities, but then later also other students, were more exposed to a risk of underachievement or to a risk of experiencing some form of discrimination within the mainstream setting. And so we started having some regulations that had a focus on certain groups of students. And I personally think this is also somehow connected with some challenges we are facing also nowadays also. For example, we have now a big definition of special educational needs that is divided into 3 categories. The first one is the one of disability, then the one of learning disabilities, and then the one of social disadvantage. And what is different for these children is the fact that they do not follow the national curriculum, but they work according to an adapted curriculum, so according to an individual educational plan. In the case of learning disabilities and social disadvantage, they have to reach the minimal goals of the curriculum. But in the case of disability, if necessary, they can work according to other goals. What this causes is the idea in some teachers that you are doing like 2 different forms of planning, like the different sheets I was speaking about at the very beginning. You have made a structure out of it, so you are doing a planning for the class and then this separate planning. And I think I understand why it was conceived, but at the same time I think this is very risky for the way you work then in class and in teaching and learning.
And how long, because that sounds like a regressive step, the introduction of a category kind of model like that. How long has that been in place, and is there any evidence that has impacted on the outcomes of those students or anything like that?
Well, this is a problem for Italy because our research is not much and is quite young. Maybe you have seen it also in some reports. We have some very interesting experience, but research in this field is really very young. So, for example, also our national evaluation system cannot give data about learning results of students with disabilities. So we cannot really describe what is going on in terms of effectiveness in learning results. but I think we have some results that show that the choice for inclusion was an effective one for persons with disabilities. For example, we have some data that show they are having longer school careers. So in the time their school careers are getting longer, and longer school careers are also connected with perceived better life satisfaction. So if you ask them about them or their families, in some cases, about their life satisfaction, those who had a longer career have also better values in this aspect. So I think it has certainly some positive effects. We certainly need more research to make it visible.
And is there evidence to show, like, given the kind of, comparison, say, to Ireland, is there evidence to show that students with disabilities make a transition to further or higher education or employment? Is there any, and you're saying the research is young, I understand that, but is there anything to suggest that the students with disabilities are more integrated into the community and participation in adult life?
Well, I think what we have data about is the attitude of peers. And you see, for example, that also in this case, like in the case of teachers, the attitudes are very good. So I think this is a sign of something that a society around school is changing, and it makes the living environment for people, for persons with disability more welcoming. About the transition to work, no, I couldn't name data now. No,
it's difficult, and I think it's difficult across a lot of national contexts to kind of get access to that data for students with disabilities and without. You mentioned the kind of change in policy and perhaps introduction of categorisation as being a kind of a new tension. Is there anything else, like, going forward in the Italian context that you think you should focus on, or the government or policy should focus on, in order to ensure or maintain inclusive education for these students?
I think another challenging aspect is the role of support and the way support is organized. Also in this case, we make the experience that the main form of support we have is these support teachers that are given to classes attended to by students with disabilities. And this role, there is some research on this role, and it is very ambiguous. Legally, it is a teacher that is responsible for the whole class, so it is very framed in a very inclusive way, being part of the team, fully part of the team, responsible for all the students of the class. But at the same time, there is this sort of contradiction, because it is given to the class only because of the presence of one child that has the entitlement to that has been recognized as a child with a disability. So does
the child need to be diagnosed in order to? Okay. So that has,
and so these teachers, they can be a very good resource, and in cases where everything works well and collaboration works well, then they are really the second teacher in the class, and it works perfectly. But we also have a lot of situations where these teachers describe they do not feel they are proper teachers. They are like a help, a support, sometimes even an angel, a hero, but it's not a proper teacher. So this status of these teachers, this is something we have to work on. And maybe this is also something we are reflecting on. it's a structural problem. Maybe it could make more sense just to think that in those classes we need to have more personal resources, but not different personal resources. And then having a team growing in competencies, looking at the needs they experience in their class. So I'm thinking, for example, of in-service teacher training that can be given as a form of a support to a class teacher team that has to deal with a more complex situation, but where the competencies are transferred to the teachers and where they become really responsible for everybody.
So the support teacher has a separate title, but do they have separate, is their education, their training the same?
They are actually, I would say, teachers plus, because they are trained like class teachers and then have an extra specialization. So it's very strange because they are more trained, but their status is not as good as the one of the class teachers. So it's really a tension.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Heidrun, I've learned so much in the last half an hour. Thank you so much. But is there anything you'd like to raise before I let you get back to your day?
Well, maybe just as a final sentence, trying to think of what we could learn from the challenges we are facing. I mean, we are a country where this inclusive experience is already quite long, and we still think or we still have to struggle with some challenges that I think might be avoided by countries that are developing now their structures for inclusive education. And I think trying to look very carefully at the tensions that arise from having some special measures, special funding for some specific groups of students when you are trying to create an inclusive school systems. This is a very important part of the work of people working on policy levels, because the risk of creating contradictions and giving to people then working in practice contradictory messages about who is responsible for who and which diagnoses are needed. These then has consequences for our children and students, because they are the ones who are labeled, they are the ones who experience being marginalized, for example, by an IEP that is thought with the best intentions but could lead to some marginalization. So I think looking at these tensions and trying not to recreate them, being very clear in the policy you are constructing, this is a very important part.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And it's really useful from an Irish perspective, because we are undergoing a consultation about possibly moving to an inclusive model. So learning from a country with 40 years experience is definitely wise on our behalf. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And it was lovely to meet you.
Thank you, Joanne.
I hope you took something from that interview. So thank you for listening. Feel free to spread the word and share the episode. You can find out more from my academic website, bankoninclusion.com, and I will catch you next time.